Welcome back. Glad you're here. Sit back for a most informative, most shocking program tonight as we trace the roots of America's biological warfare program and bring you fast forward up until today when we have some very serious issues to consider about what our government has been doing for the past 50 and 60 years and how those experiments, if you will, have affected and impacted millions of Americans as I speak. This whole issue of Americans investigating, researching, constructing, building, creating biological weapons, biological elements, biological devices goes back much farther than most of you realize. We're going to talk about that tonight in great detail with Don Scott. Donald Scott is a remarkable man who is held in very high esteem by many people who seek to find out the truth about what our tax dollars have been creating for a long time. And many of you listening right now have, at the moment, or have had bouts or maybe long-term issues with chronic fatigue syndrome. Stay tuned. We're going to tell you through the eyes and mind and concepts of Don Scott exactly what you have been afflicted with, why you're suffering, and what you might do to help take care of the issue so it either goes away now or doesn't ever come back again. This is going to be one component of tonight's discussion. We are going to talk about prions as well. Information from Don Scott will shock you, but probably most profoundly tonight we're going to talk about HIV and AIDS, where it came from, what it's all about. Lots on the plate for you, so if you have a tape recording, you want to tape this, by all means, roll tape now. We'll tell you later how to get tapes of this program should you miss it. Donald Scott is an adjunct professor of the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation, located in Southern California, which has chapters in the United States, Canada, Australia, Puerto Rico, and Kenya. Also on the faculty of that foundation are Dr. Garth Nicholson and Harold Clark. Welcome to the program, Don. I'm glad you made it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here.
Tell us just briefly, as standard operating procedure here, what the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation is, and a little bit about Garth and Harold Clark.
Well, the early research that I undertook into the causes and origin of what was called chronic fatigue syndrome led me to the evidence which suggested that not only was there an actual physical pathogen causing these terrible diseases, or this terrible disease, which was sometimes labeled as a psychological disorder.
Right.
It's not that at all. It has a very real physical basis. And as I extended my research, I was startled to discover that not only is there a physical basis for chronic fatigue syndrome, but other diseases such as Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's colitis, these diseases have the same basic pathogen.
All right, we're going to talk about that in more detail, but just for our listeners, Don, you are again adjunct professor of the Institute of Molecular Biology and
Molecular medicine, yeah.
Medicine in Southern California. Tell us just a little bit about the organization so people know. I want to get that on the mental map here.
All right. We wanted to unite representatives of research into these neurosystemic degenerative diseases. So we created the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation, and we invited people who are suffering from or who have relatives suffering from or who are researching the diseases mentioned, Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, and so on,
right,
to join us in a common cause to bring forward to the public the main source or the source of these diseases. And that's what our foundation is seeking to do. We have people who are specialists in AIDS and AIDS research, in study of the mycoplasma. That's where Dr. Garth Nicholson comes in.
Sure.
And also, for example, rheumatoid arthritis. Dr. Harold Clark is undoubtedly the world's top expert on rheumatoid arthritis, and he says without hesitation that rheumatoid arthritis is caused by a mycoplasma. And, of course, Garth Nicholson's great contribution has been the identification of the role of the mycoplasma in Gulf War illnesses and in chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. We also have people who represent research into Crohn's colitis, into certain kinds of cardiac problems. All of these have a common cause. All have a root pathogen which manifests itself in different ways in different people because each person has his own genetic pattern, and these diseases have a facility for accessing certain cells based upon the genetics of the individual.
All right, they can dial them right up.
They can indeed.
Yeah, it's amazing. Let us, if we can, before we talk about mycoplasma in more detail, which is a key component in the illness of millions of Americans right now, this moment, and countless others around the world, let us go back, if we can, Don, to 50 and even 60 years ago, just after World War II, during World War II. What were we doing back then? We used to call that, advanced medical research. Now, a lot of it would certainly be called black operations or, well, whatever. But it's certainly not on the front burner. It's hidden well from the public view. What were we doing 50 and 60 years ago in those secret labs and clandestine research efforts?
The date I focus on is 1942, when Canada, Britain, and the United States were allies in a great war. And it was decided at that time that these three allies would unite to pool their understanding of bacteria and viruses for the purpose of creating biological weapons.
Right.
Let's get together. Let's find out how we can take a disease such as brucellosis, how we can take the disease agent from that bacteria and use it against our enemies. And in 1942, Canada, Britain, and the United States came together. The United States established the biological research base at Fort Detrick. Canada sent representatives down. Britain sent representatives over. Canada had already been doing research in biological weaponry. So had Britain. And with the pooled efforts in 1942, that's the date where I really focused my beginning.
Now, Fort Detrick began its work then in 1942.
Yes, it did.
Goes back further than I even thought. Were we aware back then, we must have been, we had broken the Japanese code, that they were doing work in this field as well, and in fact using it on the Chinese, among others?
Well, the code breaking, I don't think, ever revealed the biological warfare testing that was going on in Japan, but we do know that in 1945, when the war ended, the leader of the biological warfare research in Japan, a medical doctor by the name of General Ishishiro, was captured by the American Army, and it was learned from Ishishiro that he had a military unit called Unit 731,
That's right,
where Allied prisoners of war were used as guinea pigs to test various kinds of biological weapons. And this included American soldiers who had been captured in combat, were taken and staked out in fields, and had bombs exploded in their midst to see how many of them, so many hundred feet away, would become infected with a particular disease agent. Well, General Ishishiro, when he was captured, he was given an option. He was told by the United States military, look, General Shiro, you may, if you wish, join the United States research into biological weaponry and share all of your understanding and experience with us and get paid by the United States, or we will try you as a war criminal and execute you. Well, General Shiro opted, of course, to work for the United States, and he gave them all of the details of the research that he had been doing. the American government sent over a number of people from Fort Detrick, we've got a list of their names, to Japan to debrief him. And this is now fairly common knowledge about Unit 731. However, our research turned up something else that I don't think has ever really been brought forward before, and that is that General Ishishiro revealed to the American military that in 1942, Japan had established a biological test site in New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, and it was in the interior of New Guinea. Now, our evidence does not reveal what they were testing there, but it was the same area where, in 1952, 10 years later, the disease called Kuru was discovered by an Australian gold miner, and this Kuru turns out to be Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or, in other words, mad cow disease.
Right.
And our evidence is very strongly suggestive that the Japanese had taken the disease agent that is contained in the diseased brains of victims of Creutzfeldt-Jakob and had made an inoculant from it and had injected several members of the Fore tribe in New Guinea with this. Their intention was to see if they could induce Creutzfeldt-Jakob in these people. However, the Japanese were driven out before their tests could show very much, and Ishishiro, when he revealed this to the Americans in 1957 sent a young medical doctor by the name of Dr. Carlton Gazjusek down to New Guinea with his budget, and he went to where this Fore tribe lived, and he found that they were dying in the hundreds from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It was spreading among the tribe at a tremendous rate because the Fore tribe, like many New Guinean tribes at that time, when somebody died, they would eat his brain as a tribute to the individual.
Women were particularly heavily affected with it, too.
Yeah, they were the ones who would prepare the body for funeral, and they would remove the brain, and they would slice it up into pieces. They would eat it and give it to the kids. So Creutzfeldt-Jakob spread all over the place, and for his work, Gazjusek got the Nobel Prize in Medicine. However, our evidence is that he used what had been learned from the Japanese experiments in New Guinea to help us develop the AIDS virus.
Wow. All right, stand by right there, Don. We have to take a break. Extraordinary look at the potential beginnings of what we call mad cow disease now, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, however you want to pronounce it, CJD. We also have VCJD, and they talk about an NVCJD, a variant. When we come back, I want to talk to Don about the potential means of transmitting this disease, if you will. It's a protein, and we'll come right back and pursue that and much more. I'm Jeff Rentz. Glad you're here. I'm here with you 6 nights a week, 3 hours a night, coast to coast. And don't forget to visit my news site, one of the most unique news services on the planet, at Rentz.com. Okay, welcome back. Talking with Don Scott, I'm Jeff Rentz. We're talking about the origins of Kuru, which sort of appeared out of nowhere in New Guinea, but it didn't appear out of nowhere. It appeared out of somewhere, and we think, according to Don, that we have traced it back now to Japanese biological warfare experimentation on the indigenous peoples of New Guinea in 1942. It appeared pretty prevalent in 1952. 1957, as you say, Gazjusek went there, won the Nobel Prize for his work. Kuru, interesting. When he got there, the disease was all over the place. Any evidence back then or now, this has bothered me for quite some time, Don, to sustain the concept that this is a communicable disease, either vectored by body fluids or some other interpersonal exchange of something or another? Is this an infectious epidemic, or is it a you eat it, you consume it, you get it kind of a thing?
It is not communicable by any kind of sex act or fluid exchange. It has to be communicated by eating the parts of the brain and the spinal
or infected
cord.
tissues. It's a one-to-one. It's a one-to-one infection.
Yes, the same way that the Vizsla virus in infected sheep.
Mm-hmm.
When these sheep were discovered in Britain, and incidentally, there's thousands of them in North America now. When these infected sheep were discovered in Britain, and the sheep were ordered killed, so they were killed, and they were rendered into a protein supplement and fed to cows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The cows developed, or the cattle developed, mad cow disease. The brain that had been produced in the form of a protein supplement for the cattle caused the cattle to sustain a dissolving brain manifesting as mad cow disease. Then the British government, and this is under Margaret Thatcher, and the attitude they had towards
mm-hmm.
public health.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was then, well, look, let's not waste all this otherwise good meat. Let's take these diseased cows and let's make them into hamburger. So they made the British diseased cows. They sent them off to the slaughterhouse. They were made into hamburger,
sure.
and they were sold throughout Britain in hamburgers. And that is where so many teenagers got the new variant, Creutzfeldt-Jakob. It's the Vizsla virus from the diseased sheep via the cattle.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, as we all know, France has recently filed a major lawsuit against the British Agriculture Ministry, among other agencies. The British clearly lied to their people for a long time, for the better part of a decade, if not longer. They knew about this, and we all remember the progression, how it was only available if you ate the brain and the spinal cord. Then they admitted to, well, gee, it might be in the bones. So they eventually banned beef on the bone, as it were. But by then it was in the system. It was in the feed. It appears that even in the United States, the people who run the $20 billion animal and livestock feed business, although they were given in 1997 new sets of regulations and guidelines on how to make sure that the feed did not carry the Vizsla virus or anything else that would cause mad cow, is not being enforced. The regulations are being called pathetic and a joke by many observers. The American feed industry, as you'll see in my headlines, is coming under the closest scrutiny right now. The American Cattlemen's Association have called for a zero-tolerance policy against any mad cow. And just today came word, Don, that a herd of cattle in Texas has now been put under mad cow quarantine because of the feed they were eating, having come from a factory that was not paying attention to those rules passed by the FDA in 1997 that were supposed to protect us from just this very thing. So the story continues to escalate. It is explosive. When we come back, I'm going to ask Don Scott about deer and elk, which have mad cow now in Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, and other states in the United States, and a herd or two or three of elk in Canada as well. How do they get it? How are the deer in the wild continuing to come up with it when they're not eating cattle feed that apparently was the cause, they tell us, of their original infection? We wonder. We'll see what Don has to say in just a minute. Welcome back. Talking with Donald Scott of the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation, also adjunct professor of the Institute of Molecular Medicine in Southern California. So we have mad cow with us now. It is in the deer population, the elk population. It's in the cattle population. Sheep have had Vizsla for a long time. Well, but in the human population, Don, you've been able to trace this back to your satisfaction to Japanese biological experimentation and research in the early days of World War II.
Okay, now there's two avenues here. There's the avenue when Canada, Britain, and United States embarked on their research program, and the avenue that the Japanese embarked on, especially the one where they took the Wiesner virus and they induced a variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob in the Fore tribe in New Guinea. That's one thing. And from that flowed the disease agent for AIDS. Now, in Canada, Britain, and the U.S., our focus was on a number of things, but the main one that we were focusing on was brucellosis. And brucellosis is a disease of cattle and pigs, and now of dogs and certain other animals. And the three allies were experimenting with this, and they discovered, among other things, for example, that the brucellosis bacteria could cause, besides brucellosis, it could cause multiple sclerosis and other neurosystemic diseases. When, in 1969, now I know we're fast forwarding here, but between 1945, when the war ended, the Japanese research was carried on by the Americans at Fort Detrick. The British, Canadian, American research with brucellosis was also carried on, and in 1969 there was still a program of biological warfare research going full blast in the United States and in, to a lesser degree, Britain and Canada. And on June the 9th, 1969, which is a very crucial date, because on that date, Dr. Donald MacArthur, in charge of biological warfare research for the Pentagon and for the CIA, he met with 12 congressmen, and he brought them up to date on the biological warfare research that was going on at that time in 1969 in the United States. And he told them about two things. One, he told them about the development of the AIDS virus. He told them that they were just about ready to move with a disease agent, and his description of it was that it was one which did not naturally exist and for which no immunity could have been acquired.
No natural immunity was available to fight it. It was refractory. The word was refractory to our own natural immune systems
that we depend upon to maintain our relative state of health.
I have that document. Many do.
That's a very important document, and that is the disease that he was talking about was the one that grew out of Wiesner, the Kuru in New Guinea, and the AIDS virus that they were developing. Out of the British, Canadian, American research on brucellosis, they were developing another disease agent, and a lot of people, when they read the June 9th, 1969 hearings between MacArthur and these 12 congressmen, they are so taken up with the description of the AIDS virus that they miss another thing. In that same document, he also says, besides trying to develop a lethal biological weapon, we are developing a disabling biological weapon. Now, why the difference? Well, the difference is simply this. As a matter of United States national security strategy, it was important that a large part of the lesser developed countries, as Henry Kissinger, who is one of the authors of this program, their populations were growing too fast, and the Americans were facing the prospect that all kinds of natural resources were going to be denied to them by the growing populations, especially in Africa. So,
how dare they use their own resources? That's right.
Yes, Kissinger wrote a national security study memorandum, number 200, which addressed the problem of reducing the rate of growth of population in the lesser developed countries, and he specified 13 countries, most of them in Africa.
He said, in fact, that the reduction of the populations of these nations were matters of vital national U.S. security in order to procure their resources without any undue travail.
Absolutely. So the idea was we can use the Wiesner, Kuru, AIDS to destroy to kill the people of these lesser developed countries that are getting in our way in terms of strategic raw product. However, there was also a goal to reduce the population of the, quote, civilized countries, and what a use of the word.
Yeah.
Reduce the population of those countries not by killing people, but by disabling them, especially women. So they took the brucellosis disease form, which they had been working on, and which they knew was very, very effective in affecting 6 times as many women as it did men, and especially affecting a woman's ability to reproduce.
Yeah, gender specific.
Gender specific to take a significant number of women out of the child-bearing population.
That's right.
So there were the 2 of them. Now, the brucellosis bacteria, they were able, and this was reported in 1946 by George Merck of Merck Sharp and Dome. They had learned how to take the bacteria of the brucellosis and to remove the disease toxin in crystalline form, and then spread that disease toxin and throw away the bacteria, so that a person would become sick with chronic brucellosis, but you could not find anywhere in their body any sign of the bacteria, just the disease. And this is what they then labeled chronic fatigue syndrome, to hide the reality of the disease. People in the United States, Canada, Britain, and Europe, and so on, that think they have what they call chronic fatigue syndrome actually have chronic brucellosis, but you can't find the bacteria because the bacteria is not there. The only thing that is there is the disease fragment, and that is what's called the mycoplasma.
Well, that's why they say it has no membrane. It's not a full cell. They call it a strange formation of life.
Yes, and what it does, because it has no organelles to process its own nutrient, but it has a will to live.
Yeah.
The mycoplasma will uptake from host cells that it invades preformed sterols. Now, where does it get the sterols? It gets them from the cholesterol in the red blood cells, so that the red blood cells become warped and hardened and distended, and they don't go through the capillaries, and that causes problems to the brain and to the heart and to the liver and so on. It also gets it from the vitamin D production, because vitamin D is cholesterol exposed to ultraviolet light and converted from cholesterol into vitamin D, which is then used in the bones to help build the bones and manufacture new red blood cells. It interferes with that.
Yeah.
Now, it is this that is current today in many species of animal in North America. It's not the Wiesner virus that in the caribou, for example, up in northern Canada. A couple of years ago, we have a report that 30% of the caribou in northwest Canada had aborted their calves that spring due to what appeared to be Brucella abortus.
Right.
In other words, it functions primarily by affecting the genitoury organs.
Got it. Stand by, Don. Stand by right there. We have to pause, and we'll come right back and pick it up in just a minute. You might want to listen to this program 2-3 times. A lot of material, and it's very important. We'll be right back. Okay, back with Donald Scott, and Don, we're put a lot of material on the table already. Let's slow down just a little bit and make sure we don't leave anybody behind on this. Let's go back to take these one at a time. Brucellosis, just to recap it. Just to recap brucellosis, what is it? It's a bacteria. It usually infects cattle. Why was it chosen to be such a star pupil back then by American biological warfare researchers?
First of all, it was highly contagious in the natural state.
Okay.
They figured they could make it even more contagious. In fact, it is so contagious that it's one of the few bacteria that can cause infection through unbroken skin.
Yeah, all right.
So that your skin doesn't protect is not a protective wall for you.
Mm-hmm.
Second, it has the capacity to affect every major organ system in the body.
Mm-hmm.
The cardiovascular, the urinary, genitourinary areas, all the rest of these, the glandular, the endocrine.
It's an indiscriminate killer. Okay.
It can access cells in any one of these bodily systems.
Gotcha.
And therefore, it's very hard to combat. These qualities caused the researchers to focus on brucellosis. But then they started doing something else. When they had learned how to isolate the disease toxin in crystalline form, they then began experimenting to create a cocktail using certain other disease agents that would confuse diagnosis and alter the symptoms just somewhat so that it didn't totally appear to be chronic brucellosis that the victims were suffering from.
Okay, I understand. They're making it more of a stealth issue then. They're going to hide it and obfuscate it so you can't come up with a diagnosis easily. You said something very intriguing. You said crystalline nature. Is that like freeze-dried, Don?
Yes, it is. They could literally have a salt shaker full, not of crystals of salt, but crystals of pure disease. And by making a very highly refined powder from this, extremely fine, and then by mixing it with an additive to give it a greater volume, they could then spread it by, for example, 30-pound burster bombs in, for example, Korea, where they were experimented with. And these fine particles of the disease agent breathed into the lungs, then the person is infected.
Instant infection. When was this done again? This is in the late 40s, early 50s, at the time of the Korean War. So they had off-the-shelf, freeze-dried killer organisms 50 years ago.
Yes. Now, a veteran of the Korean War came up to me one time at a meeting in Rochester, New York, and he said to me, Mr. Scott, I was in the military in Korea, and he says, I was trained in bacteriological warfare. And he said, when I got out of the military, he said, they gave me and the other members who have been trained in bacterial warfare a document, 13-page document, and in that we are told that because of what we were doing, we might develop multiple sclerosis. And he said, would you like a copy of that document? And I said, I would very much would appreciate it. And he sent it to me. And we now have a copy of an official government military document which says, and I quote, if in the next 2 years you should develop multiple sclerosis, because it was so rare at the time, they added in parentheses, a type of creeping paralysis. It will be deemed to be due to the nature of the work you were performing, and you will be eligible for compensation.
Wow.
Now, what does this tell us? Well, they know that multiple sclerosis is caused by the disease toxin of the brucellosis bacteria.
Two forms of MS. Is there a genetic form and then the induced form, or is it just one?
No. When you say genetic, you mean one more or less familial, running in families.
Right.
It isn't so much the genetic predisposition to become infected as it is certain features of their lifestyle that take advantage of their genetic predisposition.
I see. Okay. Well, you got that. Then you have the induced form with the brucellosis.
Then you have to have the triggering element, which is the disease pathogen. And we actually have this document. And yet, if you say to any doctor tomorrow, can you tell me where multiple sclerosis comes from? They'll say, no, we can't tell you that because we have no idea. Nobody knows. Well, then take a look at this government document. How did the government researchers know that people who handled brucellosis disease toxin might come down with multiple sclerosis. Well, they had seen enough of their bacteriologically trained troops who have been handling this stuff. 1 in about 500 develop multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is in practically every detail a variant on the brucellosis disease known as neurobrucellosis.
Neurobrucellosis.
Yes, they both focus on the lateral ventricles in the brain and then down to the brain stem and the upper spinal column. But the multiple sclerosis is the version that is caused by this isolated disease toxin from the Brucella bacteria.
Which is a mycoplasma.
This is really what it is. Mycoplasma is a crystalline particle from the genetic nucleus of the brucellosis bacteria.
All right, what's the treatment?
Probably one of the tetracycline antibiotics.
Doxy has been used a lot, doxycycline.
Doxycycline or minocycline.
Are you suggesting, Don, pardon me for interrupting you, but there are a lot of MS people listening and people who certainly know multiple sclerosis sufferers. Are we suggesting then that MS could be treatable with a very rigid and rigorous dose, a regimen of antibiotics?
I don't want to be too absolute about that. What I do want to say is this. We know from the government statement to the people who have been handling the brucellosis disease agent that they might develop multiple sclerosis.
Okay.
We also know that the mycoplasma, which is the crystalline form of the disease agent, is treatable if you get it soon enough by one of the tetracycline family of antibiotics.
Okay, I am told. All right, go ahead, Don.
Well, okay. We have just one person who has multiple sclerosis and who is presently being treated with minocycline and measuring the results weekly. He's been on this regime now for about 6 or 7 weeks, and we're monitoring him by having a blood sample taken from him weekly and sent to New Zealand, where is the only place where we can get it done, where the red blood cells are monitored for changes in shape and so on, because what happens, the mycoplasma without its organelles has to uptake preformed sterols from wherever it can get them. One of its favorite sources is the red blood cell. It gets into a red blood cell, and we've actually got pictures, micrographs, of mycoplasmas infecting or invading red blood cells. They get into the red blood cell, they take the cholesterol out of the membrane, and they take the cholesterol out of the cytoskeleton, and the red blood cell becomes cup-shaped and bumpy and all the rest of it. Now, this gentleman is a very courageous man, and he's doing this experiment with minocycline.
All right. Well, there is work underway. All of you MS people.
Very, very limited, because very, very hard to do. The United States government is absolutely opposed to any research, really, into the mycoplasma, because they know the background to why there's so much of it around now.
All right.
They know that they were part of the creation of it.
All right, indeed. Our tax dollars at work, friends. Think about it. Again, this program available not only in our archives after tonight for repeat listenings, but you can buy your own tape copy of it, 888-836-4670, 888-836-4670. Don Scott's name is up at the top of my homepage under guests. Click on the link just below his name. You'll see a page up there with an address where you can write to Don Scott for details and information. He is in Canada, but his address is right there, and we shall continue in just a few minutes.